right, well, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fabulous. Well, welcome to tonight's webinar as part of the TESOL webinar series at Macquarie University, Department of Linguistics. And specifically, the program that we work in is Applied Linguistics and TESOL. Warmly welcome you from all over. Please do share in the chat where you are joining us from. And we'd love to hear more about you and your teaching experiences. I did a run through this afternoon. I think it's around 45 minutes, but the aim was to leave some time for question and answer. So please do have those ready towards the end, and I'll be happy to field as many of those as possible. Hopefully you got an email from me earlier today, which also includes the link to one of the videos, or the only video I'm going to show tonight, just in case there's something with the bandwidth when you have trouble accessing or hearing that video during the presentation. I'll just go to that link and watch it separately.
Yeah, the noise.
We might need to, everyone, if you can mute yourselves. Maybe I can do that. Hang on. There we go. It might help with your bandwidth if you turn off your video. I'm not sure if that's the case for everyone, but let's go ahead and dive. Got it. All right, I believe I'm unmuted. Please tell me if that's not the case. So I did want to give you a little bit of background on me. I'm Cassie Liarde, and I am a senior lecturer here at Macquarie University. So a little bit about my background. I started out as a TESOL practitioner in my before life, I guess you could say. We all have a journey in TESOL, don't we? I first taught English as a second language when I lived in the States about 20 years ago, and then started teaching English as a foreign language, first in South America, but mostly in China. And during my time in China, I often experienced a type of bias I'm sure a lot of us as foreign English teachers experience, and that is, you know, because I was a native, the venerable native English speaker, I was called upon a lot to teach spoken English and oral communication, which is fine. But what I noticed was that my students, what they were really struggling with was their written communication, and specifically their more advanced writing skills of academic writing. So the other thing was most of the exams that they would need to take were mostly privileging academic writing skills. So when I moved to Sydney just over 10 years ago to work on my PhD, I really wanted to focus on how to best support students in developing their academic writing skills. To do this, I wanted to develop my linguistic knowledge. So when we look at TESOL and applied linguistics, just got a little bit of a heuristic for us to look at. You know, TESOL is a subfield of applied linguistics, and it certainly requires us to have a strong linguistic knowledge. But I always felt that if this line was English teaching, then TESOL was a practice sort of above the line. It was the one that focused primarily on methodologies or the teaching of English, the pedagogies of English, and classroom interactions. Now, below the line is what I map as applied linguistics, which was kind of the science behind the language, the way language works and why it works well in some situations and not so well in others. So what I'm trying to do is put together some of that knowledge about language with the teaching of language and teaching of anything. And tonight just take you on a little bit of a journey below the line. If we were on the Matrix, I'd be encouraging you to take the red pill to know the full story, and you know, inviting you to have a look behind the language curtain, so to speak, explore what we found to be what is the most powerful language tool for achieving academic discourse. So tonight's presentation is just that, teaching English for academic purposes, and specifically looking at the language power tools of nominalisation and grammatical metaphor. Now, just out of curiosity, I tried to make a poll, but that didn't work. So maybe if you can put it in the chat, if you have heard of grammatical metaphor or nominalization before, maybe not tonight, but before you registered, just say, yes, I heard, or something in the chat. If you haven't, just leave it blank, because I'll just, I can do the maths from there later on. In my experience, it's not a term that we talk about very much. I had never heard of it until I started studying my, master's by research. And these are actually some of the more powerful tools that we can use. If we look at, if our language is like a toolbox, and we have a screwdriver here and a wrench here, but grammatical metaphor, which is the main term, and nominalisation, which is the most common iteration or realization of grammatical metaphor, then they're like the power tools. They get a lot done at the same time. And that's why I personally teach this tool explicitly to my students, and especially help them, to use it and to redraft their writing. But hopefully it's a tool that you can use yourself, but also teach to your students, because it really is a really empowering tool. So let's take a look at this term, academic discourse. Teaching English for academic purposes has at its core the construct of discourse in academic contexts. So really what we're looking at here is this concept of discourse, which is really critical in any context of language. And we think about how we speak or use language in different communication circles that we might want to be in, that is acceptable or privileged or the norm in that community. So I like to map this along different circles. So we might say we have, our everyday context, the language we use somewhat informally to interact with those around us, such as our family or our social circles. And then we have that language that we use pretty frequently, but in more discrete circles like school or work for more professional purposes. And when I'm teaching this to my students, I'm reminded about the old adage, knowledge is power. Well, if you know how to use language and you have the knowledge about language, if you know how to use it according to the different context you're in, then you'll actually be much ahead of the curve as many people, because we can adapt to not only our different audiences, but the ways of thinking and speaking in those communities. How helps us to navigate them more successfully, and we can persuade people or advocate or whatever it may be to become part of that in-group of whatever community we're trying to be a part of. So of course, we typically talk about that in this context in terms of academic context. So I think about language that is academic or formal or professional or institutional discourse as being on a cline, with other language. And I think we can talk about this with any language that we would use. For example, I'm always getting invited to meet with the Queen of England, and there's a certain protocol in how I greet her. So, I have to say, Your Majesty, how do you do, ma'am? Now, this is, very appropriate for that context. But in my normal life, when I'm just hanging out in the hood with my homies, then I'm probably going to say something more appropriate in that context, like, yo dog, what's poppin' G, or what's up, homeboy. So of course, this is how I speak on a daily basis in that context. But when I'm going to work or school and I'm greeting my colleagues, it's not appropriate in that context to refer to my boss as homeboy or G-dog or any of the above. So I might just say, good morning, how are you today? Or something very boring like, hi, how are you? Again, now when I'm with my friends or mates, then here in Australia, of course, hey mate, how's it going? So we see that according to where we are in whatever context, we can see our language adapting according to those contexts. So of course, tonight we're looking at that in terms of academic contexts and everyday contexts. So I put those on a cline because they're not It's not that language is either academic or not academic, it's just more or less academic, or more or less informal, or formal, or dense, and etc. But we can generally characterize language along this line for purposes of academic discourse. The language of academia or professional discourse is more concise. We tend to use fewer words, whereas in our everyday context, we use a lot more words. And a lot of that comes down to prepared versus unprepared. So you'll see it a lot of times referred to as written or spoken language, or prepared or unprepared discourse. But the reality is it's just a matter of, when we're thinking about it, when we're writing it, when we're preparing it, whether it's a presentation or a written research report, my language will be a bit more concise. Whereas if I'm speaking in my everyday, then I just use words all over the place and I'm much wordier. The other difference is in academia, in academic discourse, my language is more static. The language, these words, they have to fit on the page. I have to nail them to the page effectively. Whereas in my everyday interactions, I'm more dynamic. Everyday texts tend to be spoken texts, which are created impromptu in that moment. So you say something, then I say something, and I say something, you say something, and I respond to that. So I don't even know what I'm going to say 3 lines from now because it's not scripted. But in that context, I know that, I can respond dynamically to what you're saying. And so it is thus more interactive. I don't know if you've ever told your students, don't ask questions in academic writing. Well, that's why, because you don't want to engage them that much. I mean, I'm not about all the rules of saying just don't do that, but in general, that's why we avoid questions in academic writing, because it's too interactive and thus makes us think dynamically. But anyway, academic language is more impersonal. We try to detach ourselves from it. And in contrast, our everyday language is very personal. We're always talking about our experiences, what we're doing, and we try to be personable. So it's completely appropriate for us to include ourselves in the conversation there. And, academic language values and privileges language that is, when we're evaluating or expressing our opinion, we do it in an objective way. Whereas in everyday context, we expect people to speak very subjectively because we want to know what they think, feel, or believe. So this is the general expectation for how language is used along this continuum, according to different contexts within which we are using it, and according to the expectations of our audience. Which leads us to another context in which we see language in use. And that context is a presidential news conference. And so this served as the basis. It was from almost 4 years ago now, a press conference early in Trump's first and perhaps only presidency, where he was there with Prime Minister Trudeau from Canada, and responding to a question on from the reporter on refugees, border control, and national security. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to play a short excerpt from this press conference. And if you have any trouble hearing it through Zoom, just refer to that link I sent earlier. It's the same video. Hopefully it plays fine. And then we'll come back and analyze the text together. So let me new share.
We're actually taking people that are criminals, very, very hardened criminals in some cases, with a tremendous track record of abuse and problems, and we're getting them out. And that's what I said I would do. I'm just doing what I said I would do when we won by a very, very large electoral college vote. And I knew that was going to happen. I knew this is what people were wanting, and that wasn't the only reason. That wasn't my only thing that we did so well on, but that was something that was very important. And I said, we will get the criminals out, the drug lords, the gang members. We're getting them out. General Kelly, who's sitting right here, is doing a fantastic job. And I said at the beginning, we are going to get the bad ones, the really bad ones. We're getting them out, and that's exactly what we're doing. I think that in the end, everyone's going to be extremely happy. And I will tell you right now, a lot of people are very, very happy right now.
Canada has always understood that keeping Canadians safe is one of the fundamental responsibilities of any government, and that's certainly something that we're very much focused on. At the same time, we continue to pursue our policies of openness towards immigration and refugees without compromising security. And part of the reason we've been successful in doing that over the past year, welcoming close to 40,000 Syrian refugees, is because we have been coordinating with our allies, the United States and around the world, to demonstrate that security comes very, very seriously to us, and that's something that we continue to deal with. But there have been times where we have differed in our approaches, and that's always been done firmly and respectfully. The last thing Canadians expect is for me to come down and lecture another country on how they choose to govern themselves. My role, our responsibility, is to continue to govern in such a way that reflects Canadians' approach and be a positive example in the world.
Okay, hopefully you could hear that okay and see the PowerPoint now. Okay. So what do you notice about the way Trump spoke as compared to Trudeau? Unfortunately, we have such a big group, I won't be able to actually answer you, but think about it. How is their language similar or different from one another? What was your impression about the way they use language? Who did you find, just on impressions, to be more persuasive or more effective in their communication? When I pose this to students, which I'm just taking you through the same activity that I work through with students when I'm teaching them grammatical metaphor, I ask them, what's your impression? How do you feel about it? Which one would be more successful if they wrote that text for an academic context? And it's pretty clear which one would perhaps be more successful. But then you ask the question, why? What was it? What is it that made Trudeau more successful or more coherent, more focused, more concise? What was it that made his text sound better than Trump's? So let's take a look at our two texts here. We have what I call Trump's text and Trudeau's text, or Trump speak and Trudeau speak. Now, as we take a look behind the curtain, and it's good to start with something general that's easy for anyone to analyze, which is the number of words. So Trump's text is 185 words and Trudeau's is 168. So they're pretty comparable in terms of length. But remember, they're different messages, so you can't compare them. It's apples to oranges a bit. Now we can look at, you might find it interesting that Trump's words average 4.18 letters each, whereas Trudeau's averaged 5.06. So these are just the basics, but what we can see is Trudeau uses fewer words, but the words he chooses to use are a little bit more substantial, at least in length. But what we might want to do is look a little bit deeper at the meanings expressed in it. So the first question I go into is, who is participating in these texts? Now, when I ask who is participating or looking at participants, really what we're doing is we're just looking at the nouns or the nominal groups, who or what is participating in the text. And this is what tells us what the text is about. When you're skimming through a text of any sort, the nominal groups kind of stand out at you, and that's how you get the gist of what you're reading. So it should, by just looking at the participants, a well-written text should tell us just that, what the text is about. So let's start with Trump's participants, his chosen participants. So we, people, criminals, hardened criminals, tremendous track record of abuse and problems. We, I, I, we, very, very large electoral college vote. I, people, the only thing, my only thing, we, something, very important, the criminals, the drug lords, the gang members, we, them, General Kelly, right here. A fantastic job. I, the beginning, we, the bad ones, the really bad ones, extremely happy, very, very happy right now. So, as you just hear the participants, if you hadn't heard the text, would you have a pretty good idea about what Trump was talking about or what the text was about? And probably, I'm guessing that a lot of you are teachers of English for academic purposes, and I'm sure you've read a lot of texts that have this same exact feel to it. So they kind of go all over the place, and it's a little bit like, okay, yep, going there. Okay, where's that logic? Oh, that argument. And you just following it basically like you would have followed Trump's presentation or his response to the question on national security and border control. Let's look at Trudeau's participants. So Trudeau's participants are a little bit perhaps more predictable for what the question was asking. Canada, Canadians, safe. One of the fundamental responsibilities of any government. We, our policies towards an openness towards immigration, refugees, security, successful, 40,000 Syrian refugees, our allies, the United States, the world, security, our approaches, Canadians, another country, my role, our responsibility, Canadians' approach, a positive example. So if you just take a quick look at these participants, probably what you start to see is that in terms of topical or ideational meetings, Trudeau's is a little bit more focused on what the actual question at hand is, or what the focus or topic of this text was perhaps meant to be. Let's take it a step further and look at specifically who is foregrounded of these participants, who or what is foregrounded or emphasized the most. So for this, I'm just going to look at personal pronouns. I think this is one of the more obvious things that stands out, but it merits our attention because we're always talking about academic language is more objective and impersonal, and everyday language is more subjective and personal. So in Trump's text, we have 11 instances of I and 8 instances of we. Trudeau never uses I. He does use the reflexive me once, and he uses we and us 7 times. So just looking at that, we can see that Trudeau speaks with a lot more inclusivity and not so much me personally. So he's already detaching himself, and he's kind of identifying himself more as a representative of Canadians, which was a much more frequent reference. But we can also look at those personal pronouns. So Trump uses my once to respond or to describe a very important thing, his only thing. Whereas Trudeau uses personal pronouns quite a bit to talk about my role, our responsibility, our approach, our allies, our approaches, and our policies. So just a side note, when I'm trying to teach students about, okay, how do you achieve objective and impersonal voice? You know, it doesn't mean that you're completely taking yourself out. Now, in some contexts, maybe that's appropriate, but especially, you know, a common genre that we're seeing a lot of times in universities now is reflections. And you can write a reflection in a more objective way by talking about my experience or my general perspective on this situation. So making it a possessive and nominalizing that sentiment, that verb, rather than I thought or I experienced this, automatically just clusters it and makes it a little bit more objective and more formal and academic. So next up, let's look at the happenings in the text. So now that we've looked at the participants, we want to look at what is happening, what kinds of verbs or verbal groups are being employed here. So when we zoom in on the verbs, we can see, first of all, Trump uses quite a few more than Trudeau. In fact, he uses 34 active verbs, and active verbs won't go into, but, you know, to determine the number of clauses in a text is pretty important, because that tells us, you know, how intricate or dense a text is. In contrast, Trudeau uses 27. Now, we already knew he used fewer words, but he uses a pretty significantly lower number of clauses to express it. So when we take a look at what actually the verbs are saying, this kind of points to more about that intricacy that we see in Trump's text versus Trudeau. So, for example, Trump chooses to use a lot of verbs that demonstrate his mental processes, such as knew or wanting or thinking, as well as several of these verbal processes. He tells us what he said, and then he tells us what he's going to tell us. And all of these just kind of accumulate into this gonna message of, I said I was gonna do it, and I'm gonna tell you what I said and what I think and what I'm gonna do, and then I'll tell you what. And so it's, you know, a lot of what we talk about as delexical verbs. So you kind of need the main verb or the context to tell you what's actually going to go on. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what? I'm going to do that activity. Whereas Trudeau's verbs are a little bit more substantial in that all we have to do is look at that single word to understand or focus or experience what he's saying, such as pursue, compromise, coordinating, welcoming, demonstrate, deal, differ, lecture, govern. So fewer verbs, but the verbs that he is using there are much more meaningful. So a lot more meaning packed into fewer words. That's a theme I want you to remember as we come into talking about our power tools. So in short, Trudeau uses fewer verbs and clauses to convey his message, and the words he chooses are significantly more substantial and meaningful. They tell us something about his message as compared to these delexical or empty verbs that we see a lot of in Trump's text. Now, it's about here in the lesson with my students that I ask the tough question. We all think that Trump's speech is erratic or incoherent or wordy or imprecise. It's extremely personal and subjective, and we know that those are things that are associated with more everyday contexts and informal. But for many of our students, and probably even some of us, so is our writing. So it's here that we all kind of have to acknowledge, yes, sometimes my writing sounds a bit more like Trump than Trudeau. And students will always laugh at this point as they giggle and, oh, yeah, that's true. And you ask, have you gotten feedback on an essay? Have you been told that it was too wordy or incoherent or whatever the terminology might have been? And I might want to point out here, I know that EAP is typically taught in context with TESOL, but I have traditionally taught this with students whose first language is English as well. And I think it's a really critical thing to point out, as many have, is that when we're teaching EAP, is the fact that nobody actually speaks it as a native language. Everybody is a non-native learner of academic advanced literacy and writing and speaking. So at some point in our lives, we need to adapt to academic discourse, but nobody comes out speaking this. I have a 4-year-old daughter who speaks fluent Australian English, and she likes to say things like, "Mummy, I know that already," or "Mummy, I told you that yesterday," you know. But she doesn't say things like, "Mummy, that information and message was communicated yesterday," or "the communication of that message was relayed the day before today." You know, you don't have that kind of recontextualization of words until, you know, the research shows us around adolescence, when children are more exposed to more advanced literacy, more texts, where they are not so much learning to read, but reading to learn. So that's typically where your native English speakers are building up their grammatical metaphor. But for all of our students, nobody teaches them that. So once we actually teach them how to speak and write this way, they can become much more successful. So we know that for many of our students, whether English is their mother tongue or an additional language, formulating and shaping our expression to be more static, dense, concise, objective can be difficult. So while it's fun to compare Trump and Trudeau, at the end of the day, we need to recognize that they're actually giving us two different messages. So it's, we're not just comparing apples to oranges here. It's kind of like tinned tuna to caviar. So we can't just say, okay, speak more like Trudeau, but we have to actually go back to the Trump original, as I like to call it, and look at how we can transform it. So if our writing looks like Trump's, how do we adapt it for an academic professional context? And is it possible? So we have to retain the message. And this is a key thing whenever you're teaching academic or especially grammatical metaphor, because when you start to play with language, it's easy to change the meaning. So we want to retain his original meaning for whatever reason. We're going to retain it, okay? And we need to now transform the language so that it is presented in a more formal, concise, impersonal way. So let's get started. And I'm going to go through this quickly because different contexts, and I want to have time for question and answers. But this would obviously be much a slower process where we look at the different transformations here. But Trump original, we're actually taking people that are criminals, very, very hard criminals in some cases, with a tremendous track record of abuse and problems, and we're getting them out. And that's what I said I would do. Sorry, I can't do a really good Trump impression. Our focus here is on deporting those hardened criminals with a tremendous track record of systemic abuse. This is an important follow-through on our earlier promises. I'm just doing what I said I would do when we won by a very, very large electoral vote. I knew that it was going to happen. I knew this was what people wanted. When we secured the presidency, we aimed to capture the expectations of the American people. Now, that wasn't the only reason. That wasn't my only thing that we did so well on, but that was something that was really important. I said we're going to get the criminals out, the drug lords, the gang members, we're getting them out. General Kelly, who is sitting right here, is doing a fantastic job. Among the many priorities we set out to achieve, deporting those most detrimental to our society was our top aim. And General Kelly, who is sitting right here, has effectively led this charge. And I said at the beginning, we're going to get the bad ones, the really bad ones. We're going to get them out. And I think in the end, people are going to be really happy. Throughout our tenure, from candidacy to the presidency, we have maintained these exportation goals to target those who impact our society the most negatively. So this captures how we can transform Trump original into the language that's more reflective of the professionalism, coherence, conciseness of Trudeau. But what do we actually need to do that? What's the difference there? Not everyone can just play with language like that and come up with these different versions. So what is it? How do we make the leap from Trump speak to Trudeau speak? Well, when we are looking at academic expression, we tend to characterize it or describe it in three key ways. We talk about it being concise, static, dense language. Language is typically organized in cause and effect relational networks. And it is objective and impersonal. So I'll just, if somebody can, you might need to mute again. I don't know if you're getting a lot of background noise. But if you can just make sure you're on mute. All right, cool. John, I might need you to mute all, and then I'll unmute myself. So anyway, academic expression. got it, thanks, is concise, static, or dense language. So what do we mean by this? For language to be considered static, it needs to be noun heavy. So like I said earlier, language needs to be sort of nailed to the page. The language that sits still the most is nouns. And this is where we get that term lexically dense. So language that is more like heavy in a sense. Whereas language that is verb heavy is considered more wordy or less concise, and that is the opposite, which we would call grammatically intricate. Now, around this point, I go through an exercise with my students on mapping lexical density, and they analyze two texts and look at the actually count words and see how dense or not dense certain texts are and what makes the difference. But for purposes of our talk tonight, I'll just jump ahead to the conclusion. So how do you make language more noun heavy? How do you transform grammatically intricate, imprecise language into lexically dense language? You make it a noun, which is our fancy word, nominalisation. So to do this, I use the example. Because I was sick, I had to turn in my paper late. What we have here is a hypotactic sequence. So it's actually two clauses, two independent clauses linked through a relator. Because I was sick, I had to turn in my paper late. Now, we want to start to play with this language. So for example, this clause, I was sick. Let's just start with that. How can I take I was sick? What is a way to say I was sick as a noun? Well, we could just say my sickness. And then if we're starting to transform clauses into nouns or nominal groups, then what we need to do is look at the relator around it. So because, another way to say because is as an adverbial. And that would be, for example, you can say because of or due to. So now we have a new clause, due to my sickness, I had to turn in my paper late. So our original two-clause hypotactic sequence is now a single clause. So what we've done is created more static, concise, and dense language. So anytime you go from two clauses to one, that's automatically more dense, but we actually change the number of words, etc. Now, another key attribute of formal academic expression is that cause and effect relational networks. So academic language really privileges language that is related to one another in these cause and effect. So due to X, Y happened, X led to Y, Y is the result. So we're really often reporting on the interrelationship between phenomena. So let's take our example one step further. So now our new clause, due to my sickness, I had to turn in my paper late. Well, let's play with this a little bit more. Now, whenever you're trying to nominalize or transform a clause into a nominal group or a verb into a noun, you zero in on a noun. So our noun here is I had to turn in my paper late. So turn in is my main verb. Now, I include this here because usually there's often an extra step in the process. So if you think, okay, my sickness, that was pretty easy, but my turning in of my paper, no, it doesn't work. So sometimes you actually have to do this in between step of transforming the verb into something. Okay, what's another word to say turn in? Well, you might say submit. And then that makes it a little bit easier to change submit into its noun form, which is of course submission. So now I have the late submission of my paper. So now that I've got my two nominal groups, make sure you don't stop there. Students will stop there and then you got fragments, and that's a whole nother issue. So we can't just say due to my sickness, the late submission of my paper. We have to actually take that relator due to and get it into the clause. So we take due to and make it into a verb. What's a verb? That means cause leads to, results in. Let's just use led to for purposes of tonight. And so we have my sickness led to the late submission of my paper. And all of a sudden, because I was sick, I had to turn in my paper late, becomes this much more formal, static, cause and effect expression. Again, not how we speak in our everyday life, but it is how we expect people to write in more advanced academic contexts. Another characteristic of this cause and effect, but we often speak in relational networks. So if you look at the writing in academic context, it's often defining, describing, taxonomizing, and evaluating information. X is Y. She is the teacher. She is the good teacher, or she is a good teacher. But often we are evaluating it as more or less reliable, and we just have X and Y in relation to one another. And to achieve these aims, the most powerful verb you can use in academic English is, with the verb to be. Because when you have is, when you have this really flimsy verb is, what you have is all the meanings are packaged in this nominal group linked to this nominal group. And so that's what achieves those noun-heavy expressions. So let's take our example to the next level. My sickness led to the late submission of my paper. Now we have to think about this pretty carefully. Led to doesn't have a nominal form, so I'm going to use caused, because caused can be transformed into the cause, or if you had results, you can have the result, and that's fine. Now I need to be very careful at this stage, because X has led to Y. You can't just flip them around, so you have to be careful. I'm going to put my sickness first, and then I'm going to put the late submission of my paper last, but we can play with that in a minute. And caused becomes the cause of. So my sickness, the cause of the late submission of my paper was. And so now I have relationally organized the original dynamic, wordy meanings. I was sick. I had to turn in my paper late into my sickness was the cause of the late submission of my paper. Now, just a little side note, I don't know if anyone's not a fan of passive voice, but I always say, use it for good purposes. And the reality is, it depends on what you want to foreground. So in English, what we want to emphasize is what comes first. So maybe I'm not really wanting people to have pity on me. So I'm not going to focus on my sickness. I'm going to talk about the late submission of my paper. And my sickness, I'm going to de-emphasize. So I can't just say the late submission of my paper was the cause of my sickness. I have to change the meaning to the result of. And students often have trouble around that. But, you just pointed out to them like, oh, yeah, right, that's how it goes. So what we've done here is transformed, because I was sick, I had to turn in my paper late, to the late submission of my paper was the result of my sickness. And we have so much. We've really condensed our meanings there. Now that might not be appropriate in some contexts, but I do it just as a demonstration of what's possible, because language is fun to play with. And then we look at that last attribute of formal academic expression, objective and impersonal. And if you look at the series of sentences we have here, in our first sentence, I was sick. I had to turn in my paper late. I personally am the actor acting upon these situations. But immediately with the first reconstrual, my sickness, I had to turn in my paper late. Then it becomes my sickness, the late submission of my paper. So you still, like I said earlier, I'm still in the sentence, but you don't notice me when it's my sickness and my paper, especially my paper being so far at the end of the sentence, You barely noticed that it was so late. So what do we have here? These are grammatical metaphors. My sickness and the late submission of my paper are, of course, examples of nominalisations, or experiential grammatical metaphors, if you want to be technical. Due to, led to, the cause of are examples of logical grammatical metaphors, which work together to transform texts in really powerful ways. So probably you've heard of metaphor before, but typically when we talk about metaphor, it's in terms of lexical metaphor, which metaphor just transfers something onto something else. So lexical metaphor transfers the meaning of one lexical item onto another. Her heart of stone. Her heart has the attributes of a stone. It's cold, it's hard. Grammatical metaphor follows the same sequence, but in these terms, it's on the grammar. So transfers the meaning of one grammatical function onto another grammatical function. A clause becomes a nominal group. A relator becomes an adverbial, or a verbal group, or a nominal group. I was sick, so I had to turn in my paper late. becomes my sickness led to the late submission of my paper. So you have all of these interactions happening with the language. And what's happening is by scrambling, as Martin likes to say, Jim Martin, by scrambling the limits of the language, we then can use it in much more powerful ways. We can express ourselves in much more effective or smooth ways, whatever the context might be. And we sound better. I mean, there's nobody arguing that Trudeau sounds a lot better and more sophisticated than Trump. And when I sent the article in that Sharon and I wrote that I sent you all this morning, you know, one of the feedbacks from one of the reviewers was, well, we can't say that Trump wasn't successful because he got elected. We can't argue with that. But in terms of when we are mapping this onto academic or professional or impressions, the reality is, you know, a lot of things have been upside down lately, but we generally will privilege language that sounds more like Trudeau. So around this point, it's time to practice with the students. So what I have them do is actually play with the text, go through, highlight it, you know, step one, read through the text that we're looking at, and then they look through their own text and highlight any sentences or phrases that seem wordy or unsophisticated or anything that just seems informal or repetitive. So, you know, we're getting them out. That's what I said I would do. The criminals, we're getting them out. So there's a lot of repetition there, but there's also just a lot of wordiness. So a lot of phrases that could be more concise. So then we start to play with it and look for the verbs there that could be transformed into nouns or nominal groups. What I said I would do, our earlier promises. You know, what I said, you know, when, and I knew it was going to happen. I knew that this was what the people were wanting. We aim to capture the expectations of the American people. So again, it's not like, you know, a lot of times in academic teaching EAP, the focus is on the vocabulary, but vocabulary only gets you so far. You actually have to know, you have to be able to play with the grammar. Otherwise, you'll be limited. So it's a really powerful thing to teach students how to use the grammar to manipulate language for good, of course. So then we play with it, and I'm not recommending anyone go to the level of Trump Take 3 here, but you can take it even further. So we can go through, even once we've played with it on one level, we can play with it even further. So we said we're going to get them out, and that's what I said I would do. Our focus is on deporting those hardened criminals. We secured the presidency, deporting. So then we can see, do I want to take it to another step further? Because I could go further on that continuum. I could say the focus is on the deportation of hardened criminals with a tremendous track record of systemic abuse, a significant realization of our earlier commitments, at the attainment of the presidency rather than we secured the presidency. So you see that we can just play with the language even more to transform it, just to show, in contrast, that language occurs, you know, on a cline, and we can get it to be even more dense. Now, before we go any further, I also get them to check. So we have 3 versions of the original, so 2 different takes on the original. And what's critical here is that we have to retain the original message. And so I always make them go, okay, does Trump Take 3 match Trump Take 1? Does Trump Take 2 effectively communicate the same? And the reason for that is when you're playing with the grammar, it's very easy to change the meaning, not just the cause and effect or the result of, etc., but the actual meanings of the words. And we've done a lot of research on students taking up this skill. And one of the key things we also find is over-condensation. So Trump Take 3 will probably be appropriate in certain contexts, but not many. Trump Take 2 will probably do the trick. So you also get them to learn to unpack the expressions as well. And remember that clarity is key. So if they're ever on the verge of, oh, I don't know if they'll understand that or not, then absolutely unpack it. And that's actually one of the more powerful skills, a webinar for another day, of knowing about grammatical metaphors. It's not just boosting your writing skills, it's actually boosting your literacy skills altogether, because then you can read dense texts and unpack the meanings and understand them, and that builds your knowledge. And anyway, another day. So as we look at this, what we end up with, freezing, okay, is what I call the continuum of sophistication. So we can take language that is unsophisticated, tangential, all over the place, and we can transform it. And if we just get into the language a little bit, play with it, and learn the general processes of, you know, a verb becomes a noun, a relator becomes a verb or a noun, and just understand what are the possibilities, then we have a greater chance of communicating more effectively in these professional academic contexts. So in review, when teaching English for academic purposes, a few key points I want to leave you with when working with and teaching the language power tools of nominalization and grammatical metaphor is that we use language to communicate our ideas, express ourselves, and it's important for us to realize how we use it in different contexts so that we can adapt it according to where we are. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Thank you. Good. The more we know about language, and this is, you know, knowledge is power, knowledge about language is power, the more we can be strategic in the way we communicate ourselves to persuade people. You know, we often expect our students to write persuasive essays, but we don't actually teach them the actual rules of persuasion and how to build an argument and how to put certain information at the beginning or the end. So playing with language helps us to present ourselves as informed, knowledgeable, worthy to be listened to individuals, which we want our students to be. And to do all of that, we can go to the power tools of grammatical metaphor. It's a power tool because it does multiple things at once. It makes the language more concise. It makes the language more coherent. It builds arguments. It removes personal subjective voice. It obscures the source of the action or the evaluation. It reorganizes language into these relational cause and effect networks. So it does all of that at once. That's why it's a power tool. So it's not just doing one thing at a time. So it's more efficient in boosting our academic expression. But we need to be cautious when using it. It is a power tool. So we need to be aware of the different degrees of grammatical metaphor and know our limits of that's too dense. Don't go there. Nobody understands what you're talking about. But also remember that grammatical metaphor is found in our everyday lives. And now that I've incepted it, I've got inception in your minds, you're going to see it everywhere. You know, caution, limited availability. It's everywhere in our everyday lives. And so we're kind of expected to recognize it and unpack it anyway. But if we can kind of integrate it into our writing, be all the more successful. So thanks for joining us tonight, learning about the power tool of grammatical metaphor and its most common form, nominalisation. We have about 8 minutes or a bit more for questions, but I'm also happy to take any questions via email as a follow-up. I will try to see. So if you want to take yourselves off mute, I can't see the chat, so somebody else will have to tell me what the chat says. But happy to take any questions. I know that's a lot of content in a little bit of time, but thank you for listening and following. Anyone have a question or a comment?
I just wanted to say, if I may, thank you. I have never imagined that I could attend a lecture on nominalisation and grammatical metaphor, and that it would be like a sort of page turner of lectures. The time has flown. Totally engaging. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Hi, Cassie. John here. I'm just telling you that the chat's going off, so I'm just going to try and find some questions and read them out. So if anyone has a question that they want to speak to, then please say so. And if you type it into chat, then I'll read it out to Cassie. Actually, now I've got one. So I understand grammatical metaphor to be playing around with the grammar to communicate the same meaning in a different way. Yes? That's the question from Elizabeth.
Yes, that's a very simple version of it. But having said that, the reality is you are retaining the original message, but the way you are expressing it adds another layer of meaning. So in a lot of ways, what you're actually doing is packaging and condensing more meanings onto fewer words. But yes, the general principle is you want to retain the original message. Otherwise, you know, you're not just, you know, you're not just massaging your language, you're actually, creating a different message. But you can see that even with the example, I'll just try to quickly go back. I don't know if I can. With the 3, you can see, Trump take 3 doesn't look anything like Trump would ever say. So you see that there's meanings there that are beyond the word. So yes, there is still a little bit of more meaning happening, but in principle, yeah, the point is to retain the original message as much as possible.
I'll jump in quickly too. There's lots and lots of thank yous. There's I'll give you 2 questions because I know the first one you can answer very quickly, which there's a few people asking, will you share the slides? So I'll pause for a response.
Sure, why not? I have the fuller slide pack too that has the actual slides that I teach my students, and I'm happy to share that if you send me an email. I don't want to share it too widely, but send me an email, I'll reply to you. And tonight will be recorded, and I did a pre-recording, so at one point that will be shared too if you want to rewatch it. But yeah, and the article I sent you, which you won't have time to have read already, actually outlines these processes that I've just gone through as well.
Okay, and then another question from Wong Hoi, which is, no offense, is it suitable to choose a speech for nominalisation research? When we use language orally, we tend to use more verbs than in the written context. This is
great question, and one that the reviewers nailed us on. And our argument was, which you can read in the article, is look, it's not a perfect analogy because we don't expect Trump take 3 would be completely inappropriate in a press conference. But the reality is Trudeau was completely appropriate, and Trudeau's speak is, if you actually want to measure it up, is much similar to Trump take 2. And so the point there is to show the distinction. So yeah, of course, Trump take 3 is completely inappropriate in a press conference context. And I argued that it's actually really good for us, I think, to look at the spoken language, because having been in the EAP game for a while now, we don't make the dichotomy anymore between spoken and written language, because we speak like we write and we write like we speak. Think about text messages, think about academic lectures. So, and even if you did an analysis, if you were that nerdy, on my transcript from tonight, you would see that my language is much denser than the language I use if I'm just interacting with you in less structured or less prepared context, because that language is more dynamic. So like I said, like we write text messages, and that's writing like we're speaking, and vice versa. And so I think it's good to point out to our students that it's not the difference between spoken and written language, it's the difference between academic, prepared, formal language, or technical discourse, rather than unprepared, dynamic, interactive, informal language. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Another question from Ben. Does community affect how nominalisation is received?
Yeah, definitely. If I understand your question correctly, yeah. I mean, if I'm still got my lecture hat on and I'm speaking to my husband, he says, "What are you doing?" And so he's not receiving my language very well. It doesn't vibe in that context. And like I said, when I'm in my hood with my homies, there's just a different set of language we use. And it doesn't fly there. But I also, one of the cool things about grammatical metaphor is it does empower people, because they immediately feel like they can use language more powerfully. And I've I started my career as a year 8 teacher in an inner city school just north of Miami. And I didn't know grammatical metaphor, but when you taught students just a more sophisticated vocabulary and lexes, they could use that, and they'd be like, "Yo, teach, I've got this instruction." They can use it in a really powerful way, even though they retain their community identity. And I'm fascinated by how community and vocabulary are interacting. So I'm not too specialized in that area, but absolutely, I think how we use nominalization, how we use grammatical metaphor, the key is not just, don't just use, more is not better, but in certain contexts, use it for the purposes of coherence, relational, cause and effect, etc. And raising the level of discourse. I mean, it's as simple as Trudeau raised the level of discourse, and we all got that impression, but now that we've unpacked the language, you know why and how. Maybe one more question, or does everyone want to go to bed?
Okay, so here's a, yes, all right. Most of my students are from Asian first language. Do English speakers' perception, this is from Andrew, sorry. Do English speakers' perceptions of what's academic and or formal apply in Chinese or Thai or Korean or Japanese?
Well, I think, you know, they might not necessarily have the impression right away, but that's the nice thing about the Trump-Trudeau is it at least gives us an impression of one that's pretty sophisticated and one that's not, and then you dive deeper and understand the language. I will say grammatical metaphor occurs in most languages. Any language that's written down is basically, it has grammatical metaphor. So it's not an exclusive English construct. And there's great work on it in other languages. And another area, especially in legitimation code theory, is how it demonstrates the building of knowledge. And so it's tied very tightly to how we understand things, how we unpack concepts, and how we teach concepts. You know, if you're teaching content and subject matter, you're you know, if you're doing it well, you're unpacking it, repacking it, you're unpacking it, you know, it's a really fascinating thing. So whether they automatically have the impression of grammatical metaphor being more sophisticated, in my experience, I've probably taught this presentation 24 times now to different groups, and everyone gets the impression. That's why it's such a great, my colleague Sharon sent it to me one day, and we completely revised our syllabus at that point for that semester in 2017, because it was just perfect. It was just gold. And so, you know, and hopefully it'll be out of date soon, but you never know.
You answered a few questions there actually, and then someone's just posted a bunch of links to kind of go further with on the general topic you've just addressed. There are a couple of other questions which were very big about research very broadly and about how to teach students very broadly, which I think we can't really address right now. And we're pretty close to time, so I think I'll hand it to you to wrap up.
Fabulous. Well, I'm not the only one researching grammatical metaphor, but if you do want to look at my publications, just go to the research gate and you just request the text and I can send them to you. I get in trouble if I send them to everybody. So just request it and I'll send it to you if you don't have access to these databases or if you want to read somebody else's. But, you know, grammatical metaphor, it is empowering, and hopefully it empowers you in your own ability to express yourselves and your students all over the globe. Thanks for joining us tonight, and please let me put a plug in for our fabulous moderator tonight, who will be our presenter next week, Dr. John Knox, who will be presenting on multimodality and reading the new writing, what promises to be a very riveting presentation. So thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great night.